大家好，我是四明常。那么从这节课开始，我想基本上用纯英文授课，所以从现在开始，我尽量少说汉语。在下一节课，中国同事会带大家慢慢读我们书上的那个文本，一句一句会把它读，跟大家读，然后会把背后的一些词汇、一些语法知识点，还有一些非常有意思的一些说法，会给大家讲明白。在这节课，我想给大家解释一下如何把整个这个故事概述一下。好，从现在开始，我就开始用英文讲。So in this class, my purpose is to try and teach you all how to tell this story about Confucius in as few words as possible. This is really an exercise in how to summarize. Summarizing is one of the most important skills you can ever learn in life because communication, especially in the 21st century, is everything. If you know how to get your point across, convey information with just a few sentences to the person you're talking to, then you are almost guaranteed success in whatever field you decide to work in. So when we're trying to summarize a story, we have to think a little bit about the structure of a story. How do we begin? How do we go on to the middle? How do we conclude our story? But before I get into all that, I first want to talk a little bit about a few points of vocabulary and grammar that we need to understand this story better. So obviously this story is about Confucius, and I'm sure everyone knows Confucius is our English way of saying 孔子. But you'll also find in this story the word Confucianism, or in my summary of this story is the word Confucianism. So if we think about that ism at the end of Confucianism, that ism always in English means 主义. So that if you translated it literally back into Chinese, it would be 孔子主义. But in fact, of course, in Chinese, we don't say 孔子主义, we say 儒家思想. So in English, when we say 儒家思想, we say Confucianism. Okay, another important sort of technical word about Chinese history that you're going to find in this paragraph is the spring and autumn period. The spring and autumn period. And I'm sure most of you can probably already guess, because that's a direct translation from Chinese. What that means is the 春秋 period. So at that time in Chinese history, we have the 春秋 period, the spring and autumn period, and then we have the 战国时期, which in English we call the warring states. Okay, so those are some of the more technical pieces of vocabulary that you're going to encounter in my summary. Another little phrase is inspire, 得到启发, and to be inspired by. That's something that you can often use both in your spoken English and in your written English. And obviously what comes after be inspired by is a noun of some sort, to be inspired by something. Or it can be followed by what we call a gerund, which in Chinese is 动名词. So be inspired by 后面要加一个名词或者一个动名词. And you'll see in this passage what we actually follow it with is a 动名词. Okay, but I'm not really here to talk about vocabulary and grammar. You're going to get plenty of that in the next lesson. What I am going to do, though, now is to talk a little bit about the theory behind how you summarize stories. But before I even dive into that, let me just say a few more words about this. Often when people are telling stories to a friend, or maybe telling about something that happened in your life yesterday, maybe when you're talking to a classmate about something that happened at school, or you're talking to your parents about something that happened at school, you might often find that you're telling the story and your parents don't really quite get what's going on. I have this experience all the time. I have two daughters, one 10 years old and one 5 years old. And particularly when my 5-year-old comes home and tells me something that's happened at school, it's often harder than trying to understand Einstein's theory. I listen and I listen, I can't quite piece together what's going on, even though probably what she's describing is something quite simple. But why do I have such trouble understanding what the story is about? Well, it's basically because she tends to dive right into the middle and starts to talk about things that, unless I knew some other piece of information, is not going to make any sense to me. So one of the really important things when we're telling stories is to make sure that we're giving all the right kind of background information before we launch into our story. Now, when you're in a conversation with a foreign friend or maybe your foreign teacher, you might not have the time to recite the whole of this story. You might not have the book with you, and even if you had memorized it, you wouldn't necessarily have the time to just say the whole story to your foreign friend or your foreign teacher. So it's even more important when you're summarizing the story to make sure that you can get the core pieces of information out there at the beginning, hopefully in your first sentence, before you go on to talking about the story. So in this story, we're definitely going to have to explain to our listener who Confucius is, but more importantly than that, we're also going to have to explain when this story is happening. Now, maybe a lot of foreigners know that Confucius comes somewhere from the mists of ancient time. I'm imagining most foreign friends you would know will have heard of Confucius. If foreign friends have heard of one person from China, that one person will be Confucius. And mostly they will know that he was at least 2,000 years ago. But it's important that when you start your story, you let them understand this is about Confucius. You also need to let them understand that this is a story that happened a long, long time ago. And you also probably want to give them a little bit of an introduction to Confucius. But again, we can't use too many words, so we have to use as few words as possible to try and describe who Confucius is. Because with this story, 三人行, there is a story there, but it's also a story about Confucius and his attitude to learning and so on. So if we're telling a foreign friend or a foreign teacher about this story, if you just told the story on its own, teacher on his travels, encountering some children who are building a castle and then asking them to move their castle, and the boy replies, "Hey, castles don't give way to wagons." A foreign friend might not necessarily quite understand what the point of that story is. So in this summary, we're not going to leap so quickly into the story. We're going to give a little bit more background, and then we're also going to follow it up with a little bit more about why this story is significant. Because when we're talking about Confucius, what we really want to get across to people is the incredible role that Confucius has played in fashioning and forming the ideas, the thoughts, and the values of generations and generations of Chinese people. Okay, so let's dive straight into the story. I'm going to start with the first sentence, or the first part of the first sentence, which will be, Confucius was a great thinker, teacher, and the founder of Confucianism during the spring and autumn period of ancient China. Okay, so there is my first sentence. I have said who it's about, Confucius. I've said what he was. I've described him as a teacher. And I've also said when this happened. And I said the spring and autumn period, but just in case my foreign friend is not totally familiar with the different periods of Chinese history, I've added the phrase ancient China. I might just say another thing about that word. There's a tendency when people talk about Chinese history to talk about everything before the 20th century as ancient. But in our Western mindset, when we think about ancient history, we're always talking about history that's at least 1,500 years old. So, for example, in our Western mindset, the Ming Dynasty, Ming Chao, or the Qing Dynasty, Qing Chao, and even the Song Dynasty are not part of ancient history. So when we say ancient, it's very, very clearly saying we're either talking about BC times, or maybe at the most we're talking up to about 500 AD. Okay. All right, let's move on to our second sentence. As a teacher and educator, he emphasized the combination of learning and thinking, inspiration and knowledge acquisition, had fresh ideas about teaching, and left the whole world thought-provoking sayings and aphorisms. Okay, that was quite a long sentence. Let me just go through it again from the beginning of that particular sentence. As a teacher and educator, he emphasized the combination of learning and thinking, inspiration and knowledge acquisition, had fresh ideas about teaching, and left the whole world thought-provoking sayings and aphorisms. Now, you might not know what an aphorism is. An aphorism is just a very short sentence that contains some little piece or a little gem or a little nugget of wisdom. And anyone who has read the 论语, which we, in English, of course, we call the Analects, anyone who has read the 论语will know it's not really one long piece of writing. It is divided into sentence after sentence, individual sentences, and each sentence contains a certain piece of insight or a certain piece of wisdom, and that we call an aphorism. Okay, let's go on to our next sentence. Where three men walk together, I can learn from one, is one of the most popular phrases that was inspired during his wide wanderings. So there you are. Did you see the inspired by? Inspired by what? Inspired by his wide wanderings. So wanderings is what we call in English a gerund, 动名词. Not to be confused, of course, with a participle, which is a 分词. I'm sure you'll be hearing a lot more about these sorts of things in the next class, but a participle is when a verb is pretending to be an adjective, and a gerund, 动名词, is when a verb is pretending to be a noun. But of course they look the same. They both usually will add an ing. Okay, let's go on. A young boy who blocked the way refuted Confucius with his quick wit. He said, "Castles do not give way to wagons." Consequently, Confucius not only gave way to the boy, but also paid his respects to him. Okay, and there, in those final couple of sentences, we have told the whole story. Let me read the whole story now from the beginning. And you'll see that I am able to encapsulate some background information about Confucius, a very quick summary of the story in just a few seconds. Confucius was a great thinker, teacher, and the founder of Confucianism during the spring and autumn period of ancient China. As a teacher and educator, he emphasized the combination of learning and thinking, inspiration and knowledge acquisition, had fresh ideas about teaching, and left the whole world thought-provoking sayings and aphorisms. Where three men walk together, I can learn from one, is one of the most popular phrases that was inspired during his wide wanderings. A young boy who blocked the way refuted Confucius with his quick wit. He said to him, "Castles do not give way to wagons." Consequently, Confucius not only gave way to the boy, but also paid his respects to him. Okay, let's think a little bit about the meaning of this story. We might want to add at the end of this story one more sentence saying something like, what this story shows is that Confucius, even when he was at the height of his career, a famous teacher, renowned through all of Luguo, he was still able to have the humility necessary to listen to someone much, much younger than him. And the point of where three men walk, I can learn from one, is to say that at every stage of our life, when we look at those around us, whether it's colleagues, family members, friends, or even students or people younger than us, there are always things we can learn from other people's behavior that can help to improve our own behavior. Of course, Confucius also says that there are things about other people's behavior that we should avoid. We can learn from others in that way, in that negative way too. We see someone else behaving badly and we can remember, well, when I'm in a situation like that, that is not how I will behave. Okay, well, it's almost time for us to finish this class, but before I go, I'm going to leave you with a question that you can research at home, or you can check it up in this book. When did Confucius start his wanderings? Okay, that's it from me. In the next class, my Chinese colleague will be taking you through the story again, and you'll be learning all kinds of useful vocabulary and useful phrases. But for me, from me, that's it for now. Bye.